I've got two people to help. On my right is Louise Redmond from Lord Venture, who is going to try and walk the tightrope wire of IT and going to show you a particular model of feedback, governance evaluation feedback. And beyond Louise is Reg Chapman, who's the ex-principal of Blackpool and Fylde College. And I'm going to ask Reg to start us off and get us all warmed up. Reg, with a few minutes.
Thanks, Peter. It says set the context, but to be honest, if by 4 o'clock we haven't got the context, we've not been awake today. And if you weren't awake, then Ruth Silver gave us all a reading list first thing this morning. So I'm not going to set the context, but I have a long memory. It's the grey hair gives that away as well. The white hair, sorry, the white hair. But tight funding, light touch regulation, an urge to be responsive and innovative. We've been there before in FE and in the sector. It was called the 1990s. That's the almost the decade, 7 or 8 years following incorporation. And I thought it might be useful just to make 1 or 2 links there, because there are some powerful lessons for what went right and what went wrong for the sector in those 7 or 8 years. The first thing is that, as the speaker from NIACE said this morning, colleges are really good at reinventing themselves. So those first years after incorporation, when there was tight funding, light touch regulation and so on, colleges with the new generation of principals and a new generation of governors, often from outside the education sector, really did rethink and reposition colleges, made them vibrant organisations, big players in their communities, and that's continued. But there's a but. And that but is, it was also the worst time for college scandals. It was the worst time for colleges embarrassing themselves and embarrassing their peers. There weren't that many scandals, but they were all about principals, usually with the compliance of their governing body, not usually urged on by the governing body. The governing body was usually knocked out by this genius that was going to take them to a new promised land, but really abused the freedoms, treated their organisations like wholly commercial operations, lost contact with what the purpose of a public sector organisation was. So my question really is, which college is going to be the RBS of the college sectors? Because I promise you it will happen. In that there are 300 and odd colleges. We see in the newspaper A for E. Now, I'm not talking about scandals like that of potential fraud. We're talking about people who just take the whole college off the centre of what it was there for. So out of that, I think there are just 3 lessons that are very relevant, both negatively about what to avoid, but also positively that might focus governors on the difficult times that we're in. The first thing is that to keep the mission not just in the forefront, but continually reviewed. Some of the things that colleges are doing, setting up academies or sponsoring academies, taking over commercial operations, they do significantly affect the character of a college, or can do affect the character of a college. So those are the sorts of questions about how does this fit with what we're in business for, what our prime purpose is. And it's only the governors that are going to ask that. They need to, if you like, be the guardians of that character and mission. The second thing is there is the very important role of both scrutinising and directing the executive, not directing them by continually checking and showing a lack of trust and forever putting constraints upon them. That won't work in the world that we're moving into. We do need to be entrepreneurial and fleet of foot, but trying to be very clear on what's expected in terms of the values and the direction of the college, so that the emphasis is on directing the executive to what should be done rather than stopping them from doing what shouldn't be done. And that's difficult, but it's all about building up trust. The third and final thing is that I think as funding begins to bite, and as perhaps the funding and the regime of Ofsted begins to bite in different ways, there's a tendency to deal with the short term. to deal with the immediate. And maybe the executive has that, the principal and the senior team have that at their forefront, because they're the ones that have got to survive and take it through to the next financial year. But as governors, you have a longer term perspective. You're there to hand over the assets and the reputation to the next generation, to make sure it's still there for the next generation of students that join you, and generation being quite a short period. And those are the kind of lessons that I think came out of the 1990s. Those that were successful were very clear on what they were in business for, made sure that their mission was central. Secondly, they directed their executive, but left them plenty of scope to have initiative. But finally, they took a long term, and they were concerned about the long-term reputation of the institution and how it served its local community. All of those, I think, the need to do that is show that there's need for, however governance is, for it to improve for the changing environment. We heard a little bit this morning in general about self-evaluation. What we want to try and focus on this afternoon is some practical examples. So I'll not talk to you about the context, because we've done that to death. And I'll hand back to Peter.
Thanks, Reg, and thanks for setting us off in a good way. I'd like to just hand straight on to Louise, if I can. Louise is actually a college governor at this time, as well as leading up on Lordy Bench's evaluation and feedback of governance. So she's going to talk about that from Lordy Bench's perspective.
All right.
And there's your slide.
Thank you. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you. Yes, I've been a governor at City and Islington College for the last 10 years. So have, in that period, got to know FE quite well. Once upon a time, I was actually trained to teach in FE and taught in 2 other London colleges. But I moved away from that and went into business. And I think it's that business context that's the reason I've been asked today. I've been asked to say something about what happens in other sectors, outside the FE sector, in the other sectors, what happens in terms of governance, what goes on in terms of how making sure company boards, other boards are effective, some of the methods that are used, some of the things that come out of these reviews that happen in other organisations, and then some thoughts about how that might apply to you. So I've got some material on that I'll share with you, and then before passing back over to Reg to share his work with you. So that's what we're going to do. And I'm glad you mentioned RBS, because I think probably RBS has prompted, not only RBS, but obviously the financial crisis has prompted a whole new wave of thinking about governance certainly in the commercial sector. So that's pretty important. Let me see if I can make sure I've got this. There we are. This is, it's a bit of a long quote, but I do think it's quite important. Warren Buffett, often quoted gentleman, still very well regarded. And you'll note this is his annual report 2002. So clearly well before any financial crisis. But actually immediately post-Enron, which of course was a trigger for another wave of governance reforms around the world. Why have intelligent and decent directors failed so miserably? The answer lies not in inadequate laws. It's always been clear that directors are obligated to represent the interests of shareholders, but rather in what I'd call boardroom atmosphere. My own behaviour, I must ruefully add, frequently fell short as well. Too often I was silent when management made proposals that I judged to be counter to the interests of shareholders. In those cases, collegiality trumped independence. So my thought to you is, if someone like Warren Buffett could admit that he sometimes was quiet when he perhaps thought he shouldn't have been, I think it can happen to anyone who is on any kind of board, whether it's a college governing body, whether it's a company board or NHS board or housing association, so many examples. So I think that's, I always sort of think that it happened to him, it can happen to any of us. and I guess it has happened, and maybe RBS is another example, it has happened that directors, particularly the independent directors, have not done really perhaps what they ought to have done. Great benefit of hindsight, we could say. And I quite like his phrase, boardroom atmosphere, because obviously that is important. How do we actually feel when we sit on a board? What actually happens? Who speaks? Who gets the airtime? Who's listened to? How much does it matter, this collegiality? All these sorts of things. So quite an interesting example. But if you're in the commercial sector yourself, you will maybe know some of these things. June 2010, a new corporate governance code in the UK, which was clearly prompted by the financial crisis, and a great deal of consultation and review in the commercial sector prompted some tightening up of the corporate governance code that affects listed companies, and even more guidance on board effectiveness. All this comes from the Financial Reporting Council, easy to find on their website. So a whole mass of good practice that applies to companies. It's quite interesting because these are companies listed on the stock exchange, so they are public listed companies. So of course our pension funds are heavily invested in all of these with tracker funds or more active investments, so they are public in that sense, and what they do with our pension fund money really matters. So hence quite a few rules. It doesn't cover privately funded businesses, family businesses, if it's the operating company for an overseas listed company, so it's Siemens or Bosch or in Germany, they're obviously affected by German regulations. And this is quite an important concept in the corporate world. It's a bit of a get out in a way, but this principle of comply or explain. Companies are asked to comply with the code, but if they think they don't need to comply with the code, they can explain why. They can explain that perhaps they're different. Perhaps there's a different way they are going to manage their governance affairs, and so they can explain that in their annual reports. So it's a little bit of a get-out clause, isn't it, really? And it does make me think sometimes, what will they, attempt to get away with? And a classic example is Stuart Rose, who was the chief executive of Marks and Spencer's, and then became the chairman of Marks and Spencer's. That's against the code. Not a good idea to have your CEO become the chairman. But they said, well, we needed him. We needed to keep him, we needed to retain him, that's what he wanted. But the pressure did mean that he didn't stay in that chairman role for very long. Quite a lot of outcry in the press and elsewhere. So all that affects some of our businesses. And it was quite interesting, the Co-op, and we are in Manchester, after all. So the cooperative group, headquartered not too far away from here, it's a mutual. So it is not affected by the corporate governance code. It's not a listed company, it's a mutual, owned by its members, has a very strong set of governance arrangements, tiers of governing bodies within the organisation. But as you may well know, it obviously has bank branches now, but it's going to take 630 more from Lloyds, who had to get rid of some through EU competition rules. And this time we've got the Financial Services Regulator, another regulator, saying they haven't got enough banking experts on their board. They're now going to, okay, they run a bank now, they're going to run a huge bank. We need more banking experts. So an interesting point here is the FSA getting involved. So in every sector there's regulation, there's a lot of different pressures on who are the right sort of people. This really begs the question of who should be on a banking board, who should be on a college board is, I'm sure, a very important question to you. What sort of mix of people, what sort of mix of knowledge, industry knowledge, specialist skills, all that is very, very important. Because these are the folks who are currently in senior positions. Not normally the sort of people we think of as being on a banking board. So it's coming at us from all sides. Are we the right people? Do we have the right colleagues? As well as how is all that expertise being used? So it's affecting a lot of people. This is a little bit of perhaps a bit too long, but it does lead me into the whole question of reviewing boards and reviewing the performance of boards. Board evaluation is evolving, becoming good practice, although there are also cases of flattering evaluations. That might be self-flattery, or you might pay a consultant to come and flatter you. You know, there's probably could do it either way, couldn't you? Anecdotal evidence indicates that when conducted in a robust professional manner, board evaluation can be an effective tool to improve board performance. Use of an external facilitator can improve board evaluation by bringing an objective perspective and sharing best practices. And that's the OECD in Paris. So there we are. This is an international phenomenon. But they are making the case of, it should be done. Reviews, but boards should review themselves, but also a huge trend in many sectors to use an external party to evaluate the board. So you try and sort of don't fall into too many traps, I suppose. We could debate that, but that's a growing trend. At Law Debenture, we do look at boards and we do board reviews, and I thought I would share what we cover and see what you think is the sort of thing. There's a little model here which I don't know whether you can quite read that. It's quite a good screen, isn't it? But let me just quickly go through, and actually I'm going to go through from the bottom up. The capability of the individuals. It is absolutely critical we do have the right people on the board. I think that is a very important question, and it is very important to get the right mix of skill sets, the right mix of interest groups, a good mix of people with the experience that is needed for your organisation. Yeah.
How do you balance that against the quality and diversity tick box forms we're supposed to add along with the makeup of the board?
Well, I think diversity is important. I use diversity in the broadest sense of the word, diversity, because actually a great many boards have lacked diversity.
They've probably got the right people for the job now.
Well, not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, if actually you often talk to people on company boards, they often say, well, really, they want someone they know. It's amazing how still the grapevine, the networks, whatever they're part of, are the way they find new colleagues to join them on the board. So that still happens. That doesn't actually help your diversity very much. But it is important. I think there is a diversity of skill set, backgrounds, if people are going into new markets, what do the people on the board know about these new markets, whatever they are, and it's important to do. Now, of course, you've got, obviously, in terms of equality legislation, and then there's been a whole host of discussion about women on boards. I don't know if you mean diversity in that way. Yeah. But, so company boards have got to get up to 30%, and the EU is proposing legislation which may even include quotas for women on boards, for example. So there are those questions, and I think simply if you don't recruit in a sort of equality terms diverse, you probably don't have a diverse board. I mean, I think if you do have a board that's all male, it's probably not got the right experience, basically. So companies are addressing this and having to address this. But do think about it. But let's get a bit more exciting, going up the curve. Decision making. How effective is decision making? Is that working? When we make decisions, are we, just listening to what the executive says and nodding, or are we, as a full governing body, actually getting much more stuck into the assumptions behind the decisions? What's driving change? All of this sort of thing. So, what's the real involvement in decision making? Coaching, I think that is important in the sense that I see many directors coach and support and guide and advise the senior leadership team or the members of the senior leadership team. So, you know, if you're head of the audit or finance committee, you may be able to do a certain amount of coaching and guiding and mentoring to the director of finance. Not to do the director of finance's job, but to bring in outside experience, different ways of looking at it. So things like that. So I think there is an important role. It's a kind of payback role and support role into the executive. So how well is that going? Is that happening? How well is that going? And then the top three are actually some of the outputs that we like to look at. Is the board actually having an impact on the strategy and the culture of the organisation, or is it just sort of nodding every time the executive says this is what it should be? What are they doing to improve connections with the shareholders, the funding bodies, the community, the agents outside who are important to us? So what's that like? Is that going well? And what are we doing in terms of crisis and preparation for crisis in terms of risk management? So what's our risk management framework like, and how much is the governing body actually adding to that ability to manage risk? And sometimes we all have crises. Sometimes good things happen, I suppose. So it can be a positive, not necessarily a negative. So that's just briefly, just to sort of say what we try and cover, and I'll just briefly say a little bit about what we would say. I think all boards should review themselves at least annually, and but use an external every now and again. It's over the top, I think, to use an external every year, because you don't really have enough time to kind of absorb the feedback necessarily, or to do anything. But maybe every 2 or 3 years is what we're finding is good practice, certainly outside the sector. Obviously, it's really the chairman's project, a board review. It's the chairman's responsibility to make sure the board works well. The chairman is the leader of the board. The principal or the CEO is the leader of the organisation. So it is the chairman's responsibility to make sure the board is actually operating well. And if you're a chairman, yeah, I'm sure you do take that into account. So they must drive the process of review, because they're going to get from it the things that they may have to steer through over the next year or two. So that's quite important. Sometimes it has to be quite sensitive. And I think that's fair, because many independent directors, particularly in the college sector, we're not paid. It's voluntary. Okay, in a commercial sector, you'll get a fee for it. Or at least sometimes you'll get a fee for it. So, you know, we're trying hard, we're volunteering, we're putting something into this. So if there's any kind of, oh, you're not doing that very well, you need to be a bit sensitive about that. Because, you know, people are giving of time here quite considerably. So be careful as you report, if it's a written report, for example. And I have done this where it is it's not in the college sector, but it is a public document because it's a public sector organisation. So it may well need to be on the website or be available. So we don't want to get too personal. But we also need an action plan for improvement. So pretty important. I'll just go into this. I was asked to say a little bit about this, but this is what happens in the FTSE 350, i.e. the main listed companies. And I think you can, if you look at my chart, it's the FTSE 100, so they're the biggest, and the FTSE 250 the next biggest. We've reviewed their action plans, because these are published documents, and we've given you the bluer as opposed to the greener are the higher quality action plans coming out. So sometimes people are extremely vague about what they've done a board review, but they can be extremely vague about what came out of it. And you know, so what's the point of doing one? You don't do this as a compliance tick box exercise. We talk about the tick box of equality or whatever. Do it because you're going to have some decent action plans coming out. The FTSE 100 are better at it than the FTSE 250. The smaller organisations are less good at it. Perhaps not too surprising. And this gives a quick, on our same model, about the sort of actions that do come out are the sort of things that boards do often say, and we often hear them say, impact. They actually want to do more. Boards want to get more involved in strategy, you know, setting the mission, vision for the organisation and the strategy. So although they want their executives to get on with it and do it, boards want to get much more involved. That's why this one comes out so high as an action area. So that's important. They want to do more on their own capability. That could mean changing who's on the board. They could be doing more learning, more training, more getting to know the organisation, these sorts of things. The induction, the kind of ongoing, how we stay in touch with our organisation. There's often a lot that people really think is appropriate there. They want to improve their relationships, do more coaching, improve their relationships with the executive members, with the executive team, so there's good working, the board and the executive, and through into the organisation, and so on. So that, you know, everything gets mentioned, but those are things that are priorities. I'll actually just skip that one, I think, because I'm probably running out of time. We do quite a bit of work to help people get some good information. And we do quite a bit of this on using online questionnaires. Obviously, you can go around and interview people, but if you use online questionnaires, we find we get people are sort of in a quiet mode, thinking, sort of tapping away, answering questionnaires. We get quite a little bit more information sometimes. So we like to do that. So we do have a number of ways in which we do that, and hopefully later on you'll have a go at one of these. So they are effectively checking, because you probably can't read the small print, checking to see we've got the right context for decision making. So this is a little bit like Warren Buffett's boardroom atmosphere. You know, what does it feel like sitting around the boardroom table? Do I feel I can talk? Do I feel embarrassed by other people knowing more than me? Does somebody talk too much? Whatever. Do people grandstand? That's another, you know, because they like making speeches or something like that. So we got the right context. Can we specify what are the right behaviours that we want? Diversity is diversity of decision style, so it's not diversity in terms of, you know, whatever the Equalities Act tells us, but different approaches to the way we make decisions. You know, some people like a lot of detail or a lot more research, analysis done than others before making a decision. Some people like to consult more than others before making a decision. So we get a bit of a picture there to see we've got a reasonable range. And what about our process for making decisions? And that's what we'll try in a little bit. So do we make good decisions or not? What sort of process do we use? And is that really working? So there are all ways in which we can kind of analyse what's going on the governing body in a little bit more depth. So I think I will stop there. That's the instructions for when we get into it. So any questions? Pick up.
Just one very quick question. A lot of our evaluation of governance is actually geared towards being part of the college's self-assessment review, which is done on an annual basis.
Yeah.
And obviously, to a certain extent, you're kind of following on from that. Do you see this as being a separate thing, or something that should actually be, it should be one and the same thing?
I think it should be one and the same thing. I mean, every year at City in Islington, we actually determine what's the process we're going to use. And I have to say, we seem to choose something different every year. And I think it's partly to make it different so that we don't all just think, what did I write last year, and you know, what am I going to put in? But that's more the kind of mechanics. We are going to do it. Exactly. It is part of the SAR. It all gets put into our you know, some of the outcomes that we, you know, the conclusions, all gets put into that as well, and we review it all at the same time. But so it's more a question of you know, what process are we going to use in any one particular year, and the self-evaluation, I think it is the standard, whichever method, and you might choose a slightly different set of questions one year to another. And probably you will ask the clerk to collate, or someone like the clerk, to collate that. But once in a while, having an external party come in and participate with you, which not necessarily through online tools, but through interviews or discussion groups or whatever, facilitated sessions, may be a way just to kind of re-energise that and kind of, you know, make yourselves work a bit harder, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only problem with changing every year how you do it is that it's difficult to compare.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of companies like, I mean, that's why they quite like online questionnaires, because you quantify it and you kind of get scores for different things. And a lot of people like that, and you can track them. Yeah.
You talk interesting presentation about the modelling different decision-making preferences.
Yeah.
Do you model is there any model for different sorts of relationships between chair and chief exec?
Yes, we do look at that. Yeah, we do look at that because, I mean, I think it's very important. The relationship between the chair and the chief exec can make a huge difference to how well the board works overall. So it is very important. It's one of the most important relationships. And so from the kind of coaching, what we call coaching angle, how the chairman coaches the chief exec, or the chair coaches the principal in college language, is important. I mean, they're being held to account, aren't they? The principal, the CEO is being held to account. But there's the coach, so it's quite coaching in that context. So yes, we do look at that, and the way I do it, and we like to do it, is if you do it on one of these questionnaires, we ask people to look at sets of words that describe a relationship, and they say, is it this word or that word that most describes the relationship between the chairman and the chief exec? And then you sort of get which words got more votes. But sometimes, I've certainly seen it where the relationship between the chairman and the chief exec was not really known to the rest of the board. They actually had quite a lot of meetings, they did quite a lot of things together, discussed a lot, but it was actually a bit of a black hole almost for the rest of the board. And so in that case, the board was sort of saying, you know, it's using words like mysterious or unknown, or, you know, because they just didn't know. I mean, they saw them together at the meetings, of course, but they didn't know much more than that. Yeah. So it is. I agree with you. It's important.
We'll just take one more question.
Yeah.
Was there another question over here?
Oh, sorry. There's one here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought it was excellent, very interesting. Right at the start, you did that thing, the Warren Buffett quote,
Yeah.
and you focused off the back of the quote on the person that the Warren thing, saying that he wished he'd intervened
Yeah.
in order to secure shareholder interest.
Yeah.
The thing I'm really interested in is how we determine shareholder interest.
Yeah.
Because I'm not clear on who the shareholders are,
Yeah.
particularly with the new freedoms.
It's very important.
And I'm not clear on what their interests are, because the thing about the private sector is their interests are clear. Their interests are more return on their investment. The interests of our communities, it seems to me, to be the ultimate black hole. It's
Yeah.
amorphous, it's challengeable,
Yeah.
it's contestable. And
It's fragmented.
the one thing I felt missing from the governance model is
Yeah.
another category, which is how do we go work that out? Because
Right.
the private sector doesn't have to.
Well, actually, the private sector does have, very often does have quite complicated shareholder
Sure.
issues, actually.
you-
But I
it's
do
not
take
right, yeah.
I do take your point. That, I mean, it's why it's in the framework. We call it connectedness because it is to do with how well connected you are. So do you know what they want? Do you tell them what you're going to do? Just to check to see if that's what, you know, is that going to meet the need? So that's why it's called connectedness. It's not just, so I suppose with Warren Buffett, or some company boards, you can sit there and say, they want return on their investment, as long as all that's coming through, we don't need to worry. But actually in these days, in the corporate world, there's a lot more dialogue, even if it's only on executive remuneration. But there is a lot more dialogue. But it is how well connected are you amongst anyone who might say they have an interest, a stake.
But just identifying and agreeing the shareholders in our context could take
Could
a
be.
year.
Could
A
take
board
a year.
meeting.
Well, you
And
know.
that is, I just think it's more than just the connectedness thing. It's a significant, major chunk of work that all the speakers today have thrown at us,
Yeah.
that John Hayes is throwing at us.
Yeah.
And for me, it feels like more than just the connectedness thing, because we've done connectedness to some extent over the years, and it feels like we've got to do more now.
Yeah. Right. May well. Yeah.
I think the big change that I see is that governors of further education college corporations must see themselves not as a governor of a corporation, as a non-executive director, because you can make that comparison, I can, with housing associations and NHS PCTs, for example, where
Yeah.
there's much more an NED role
Yeah.
and all the legal and compliance and regulation activities that go with that, compared with what grew out of a school governor role through incorporation. And I think the same's happening with academies now. They're going through incorporation,
Mm.
but they're certainly not having the training that we had when we went through incorporation.
Mm.
I think it's
I think
that NED role
yeah.
that's now coming up.
Yeah. And strengthening it. Yeah. And I think there could be a lot of benefit in seeing it more as an NED. To be honest, from where I sit within the governing board I'm on, to see it more akin as the non-exec director may sharpen it up a bit, actually.
You've got to move up again.
Yeah.